He joined ASCM in 1984 in Macquarie University, completed his BA Hons and MA Hons degree in philosophy, worked in Australian Agency for International Development until 2017. He's a regular worshipper in Kippax Uniting Church, married to Carolyn, and now he's working on the practical strategies to reverse global warming and through technology and cultural awareness. So we have been hearing this all the time, the global warming and climate change. So we're going to get some insight today from Robert, and today he's going to open up a conversation on how Christian faith can constructively engage with climate change. So going to look at a picture of geoengineering and eschatology. So Robert will explain to us. And guess what? We're going to offer an exciting thing for you at the end of this session. So please keenly listen to him, and you will be asked now. You can ask questions. So wait for that.
Thanks so much, Kingston, and thanks very much, Roz and the ASCM for giving me this opportunity to talk about ideas that have been at the centre of my theology and thinking for many years. And I'm going to bring to you some really new ideas which you might not have heard about before, but so I hope it's not too complex, but hopefully be able to have some time for conversation. So I think that the issue around global warming is that the dangers are actually far worse than usually discussed, and human industry over since the Industrial Revolution, since the Agrarian Revolution, has added about 630 billion tonnes of carbon to the air, and this massive amount of extra carbon, it's growing by 20,000 tonnes per minute and destabilising the planetary climate. So the dangerous warming effects as a result are interacting and amplifying the speed and impact of climate change. Now, the feedback processes are accelerating the warming that's already underway due to the past emissions. For example, the ice in the Arctic Sea is melting, turning the North Pole from white to black. And that means that it used to be a reflector of sunlight, now it's an absorber of heat. And Alaska is warming at double the planetary rate. Around the world, hotter, drier weather and resulting fires are changing forests and soils from carbon sinks into carbon sources. So warming creates high risks of conflict, collapse of human and natural systems, and political and economic structures are more fragile and vulnerable to warming than is generally accepted. So crop failure, sea level rise, storms, droughts, migration, ecosystem extinctions will only increase until we get systemic change. And what could the systemic change be? It could either involve the large-scale removal of the dangerous carbon dioxide from the air to restore a stable climate, or we could see a tipping point to a sudden irreversible climate change. So it's the biggest security risk for our planet, a phase shift to a hot house Earth. And the problem is that current climate policies offer no prospect of addressing these threats. And the UN discussion of holding warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is grossly inadequate. So after an overshoot above 1.5 degrees, as envisaged by the UN, it could prove impossible to cut the temperature again because of the committed warming that we've got from past emissions. So emission reduction, decarbonising the economy, it could delay dangerous tipping points, but it will not prevent them. And emission reduction is central to economic efficiency, pollution control, but the problem is that it does little to stop climate change, and it's an important message that's not widely understood. So we need to abandon the widely held myth that decarbonisation is enough to stop warming and instead start to look to new methods. And I'd like to share with you the sort of basic planetary arithmetic. So our world now adds about 10 gigatons of carbon to the air each year. So a gigaton is about a cubic kilometre. So, so that's how much we're adding. And that's, we're not reducing the amount we're adding, we're increasing it by about 4% a year. So over the next decade, now we add 10, in 10 years' time we'll be adding 15 gigatons of carbon to the air extra by 2030. Now, the Paris Accord has been presented as the method to address it, but what would the Paris Accord mean? It would mean if we have business as usual, without no Paris Accord, we'd be adding 16 gigatons by 2030, but if we have the Paris Accord, then that will cut it to about 14, maybe 15 gigatons. Hardly anything. What we need to do to fix the climate is we need to remove the massive amount of extra carbon that we've already got in the air. We ought to be removing 20 gigatons of carbon from the air. And because we're really standing on the edge of a precipice towards a hothouse Earth. So we've got this annual gap where we're adding 15, we need to remove 20, so 35 gigatons is the gap that we're facing. And the question is whether it's possible to do anything about that. Now, emission reduction, that's all of this stuff that we know about, wind and solar and shifting from coal and so on. It can only really fill about 2, maybe 5 gigatons of that gap. So we've got about a 30 gigaton problem that we currently don't have any plans to do anything about. And that's where the issue around geoengineering through the combination of solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal comes into the picture. Now, faster decarbonisation is unlikely. So even to double the planned Paris carbon cuts would make very little difference. There's such strong political, financial and social support for fossil fuel that efforts to shut them down will just face not only conflict and expense, but also a delay that we simply can't afford if we wanting to have a stable climate for our planet. We need to find realistic ways to stop warming, and that's where these technological responses known as geoengineering can directly cool the air and remove carbon dioxide to reverse climate change and restore a livable climate. These proposals need urgent field testing and public investment to work out which could be most safe and effective. And the public climate investment should be based on the economic analysis of the cooling impact of each proposed method. But unfortunately, the world is far from even discussing that sort of a climate policy. Now, this is all really a quite hard argument and a scary argument. And the underlying problem is that without geoengineering, the planet's on a trajectory to an unavoidable dangerous warming, with the collapse of civilization into war, poverty, mass extinction of species, and it's a stark existential reality that we face. So many people have been led to believe that geoengineering is not needed and that emission reduction is the main climate agenda. But unfortunately, it creates a recipe for collapse of planetary biodiversity and the human economy. It's a hellish future of conflict and poverty and division. So the psychology behind the debate on these issues seems almost to be that humans deserve an apocalyptic planetary collapse because we're so bad and we should do nothing to prevent it. And we really need to reject that sort of pessimistic thinking. But finding an optimistic vision requires a fundamental transformation of our human relationship to the planet that gives us life. Now, my view is that such a philosophical shift requires that we look to the whole heritage of human thought, and especially to Christianity, with its message of the rule of Christ as the only hope for the world. And the big theological thing that here is the need to explain the fall from grace into corruption as our basic existential situation and the potential for a future global redemption. Bringing back some old theological concepts and asking, can they make sense in a modern scientific secular world? We need to integrate morality and science in a way that's compatible with the underlying message of ancient wisdom and the current need for climate action. So, debate on these difficult topics requires some new integrated strategic thinking. Religious ideas could make an essential contribution, in my view, to galvanising public debate and understanding, but only if religion is reformed to become compatible with evidence and logic. So my view is that a scientific approach to Christianity offers hope for a strategic paradigm shift, putting Christian themes like reconciliation, love, transformation, truth, justice at the core of climate debate. And the difficult idea that I would like to see discussed is how a new approach to Christian cosmology can underpin such a change. So, the absence of any agreed way to stop climate change puts us in an apocalyptic situation. And that suggests that the biblical ideas about the apocalypse, which are studied under the theme of eschatology or end times thinking, could be useful as a part of an ethical and cosmological framework for addressing climate change. Now, my contention is that such study can lead to highly relevant and valuable suggestions to guide our thinking. But the only way that such study can make sense is through a shift away from the old supernatural myths and towards a science-based approach, while respecting the symbolic potential meaning in Christian texts, in biblical texts. So, the difference of opinion on eschatology, this end times thinking, is a key division between liberal and conservative Christianity. The more liberal, modern, progressive attitude looks at books like the Revelation as poetry, and while conservatives tend to take the stories of the Second Coming and so on much more literally. But I'm suggesting a new approach that combines elements of liberal and conservative Christianity based on the scientific hypothesis that astronomy provides the intellectual framework for the original construction of the Jesus story. And on this interpretation, the role of Jesus as divine mediator reflected the orderly patterns of the cosmos, not so much an intervention by a supernatural entity as God, but more something that we can understand as compatible with our scientific thinking. So, for example, the Lord's Prayer calls for the will of God to be done on earth as in heaven. And I would view that as saying, as how the ancient writers imagined the observation of the visible heavens. So these ideas involve a direct correlation between elements of end times thinking and what the gospel authors could understand of astronomy. And this raises the little known topic that I've been fascinated with over many years, which is the precession of the equinox, producing the concept of zodiac ages. And there's a transformative message that makes sense to me as a way of interpreting the Bible to say that the second coming of Jesus Christ equates to the dawn of the age of Aquarius as a possible and coherent way to explain the original intent and the current meaning of biblical texts in terms of a saying that we had in the Australian student Christian movement, we dream of a new age. So apocalyptic language often speaks of the end of the world, but it's a mistranslation of the Bible phrase, which is the end of the age. So what does this concept of a shift of ages mean? It's about planetary transformation as a way to prevent apocalyptic destruction. So the biblical concept of the end of the age is best explained in a highly controversial way by recognising that the Bible authors had an intense interest in astronomy, and they saw this long-term prophecy of the second coming of Jesus Christ in terms of their observation of the stars. They could see that the spring point was moving from the constellation of Aries, Pisces, Aquarius. Now, you might not be familiar with these themes in astronomy, but they were really quite central to the ancient cosmology, this slow shift of the seasons against the stars. And what it produces is a comprehensive cultural paradigm shift. And this transformation is partly explained throughout the New Testament, throughout the Gospels. So, for example, Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and goats, the division between the saved and the damned is just in terms of, do you perform works of mercy? Do you stand in solidarity? Do we say that what you do to the least of the world, you do to Jesus Christ? Now, I say that these sort of ideas require a new scientific reading of the Bible, seeing grace in terms of cosmic order. So there's a new age imagined in the Bible, which may have its origins in ancient cosmology, which also involves a shift to a humanitarian social policy focused on protection of the vulnerable. And this can only be achieved through a basic shift in social values to prioritise knowledge, scientific evidence, over belief and traditional mythology. So it's a paradigm shift that combines astronomy, religion and politics, and it's needed to produce an upheaval in thinking for a proper discussion of climate change. So we need to revise the apocalyptic mythology of the second coming of Jesus Christ against a modern scientific analysis, to draw from the Bible ideas to construct a new ethical framework as a systematic foundation to help us think about some of these intractable political problems such as climate change. So, discussing what it would mean for Christ to rule the world. We look to the mythology of the second coming as part of a paradigm shift to enable the world to address climate change as this intractable apocalyptic problem we face. The climate emergency requires a natural, ecological reformation of Christian theology. So I'd like to mention a key theme from a line in the Bible that's not so well known. It's Revelation 11:18, which is, "The wrath of God is against those who destroy the earth." Now, this is not a well-known verse, but it overturns traditional Christian thinking, where people see spirit as separate from nature. If the wrath of God is against those who destroy the earth, then we are integrating our sense of spirituality with natural ecology. And it shows how the Bible vision of a new heaven and a new earth needs a holistic scientific approach to ecological management of the planet within a spiritual framework governed by love and compassion. So, such a scientific theology can be reconciled with the science of long-term climate change. So when we look to the orbital drivers of climate change, now this is a complex topic which I'll just mention briefly. We have this primary climate cycle over 24,000 years, governed by the precession of the equinox. The seas rise and fall, the glaciers advance and retreat with the ice ages. And there's this underlying natural planetary climate trend between cooling and warming, very heavily masked by human effects. So I'm interested in how a new Christian theology can integrate with that scientific observation, and looking at the correlation between the traditional Christian theology, where we've got this fall from grace into corruption and a future redemption. So the orbital framework, this is just pure astronomy, from about 5000 BC through to 1000 AD was a period that is the autumn period. So we've got this 24,000 year period. So we had the fall from 5000 BC to 1000 AD. Then from 1000 AD over the next 5,000 years, we've moved into essentially a winter phase. We're now at a point that against the traditional year is called Epiphany. That is the 6th of January, when you start in the northern hemisphere, because most of the land on our planet is in the north, the northern hemisphere dominates. So when you reach the Epiphany point, you can tell that the days are starting to get longer, and you've got a view towards the next summer. And comparing that to this long climate cycle, it's over thousands of years, but it reflects a sort of underlying mythology, which we see in the Christian story of the last 5,000 years of the fall from grace, and then the prediction of the return of Christ as a redemption, which would offer a path towards peace and transformation and recovery.
And I see this as an elegant framework to explain and analyse cultural evolution. So how's all this theological and astronomical material relevant to climate change? Well, we do need to open conversation about the big problem which prevents action on climate change, which is that the world is dominated by obsolete mentalities. It's about people's thinking. And the assumptions of our obsolete mentalities really need to be challenged, and that's what I'm looking to do. We've got this ideological problem of political failure to even see the danger of climate change and agree on realistic responses. And what it shows is this deep alienation of culture from nature. We need to reconcile culture with nature. It's both within our prevailing religions and also within the technological mindset of economic progress. So the current global trajectory is toward conflict and collapse, with immense momentum driven by the ongoing acceleration of warming. And changing that trajectory requires thinking about our basic ideas. We need to see Christian spirituality as part of a natural planetary whole against a long millennial time frame. And this pervasive attitude of ignoring the dangers of the high CO2 level shows what Christian theology from the Reformation called a depraved mindset, a fallen mind mired in sin, needing a call from God for salvation. So we need new strategic thinking on our mindset to enable the cultural and political change needed to address climate change, including drawing on scientific assessment and revision, updating of older Christian ideas. For example, we can look at the apocalyptic ideas in the 3rd chapter of the 2nd letter of Peter, a text that can be read as a realistic allegory for today's needed scientific response to global warming. This letter addresses doubts about the coming of Christ by saying that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years. On the day of the Lord, the heavenly bodies will be burned up. So we should be prepared. We should prepare for new heavens and a new earth, according to the promise of Christ. So the world should look at all options to address climate change and put this thinking in a context of first principles. That makes it valuable to open broad dialogue about old Christian ideas such as salvation, heaven, hell, God, grace, conversion, providence. We need to reform these traditional ideas within a scientific framework to provide a coherent ethical vision, to better assess these technological proposals for climate restoration, things like refreezing the Arctic or growing algae on vast areas of the world ocean. A transformed thinking about religious myth can make sense for modern secular logic if we interpret God as, the phrase I would use is the complex anthropic order of the cosmos. And perhaps we can talk about that further with Sandy this afternoon and John. We may yet be able to recognise the emotional and intellectual power of the story of Jesus as the basis for a new and entirely modern vision. I hope these ideas can help open some conversation on how Christian ideas can underpin the paradigm shift we need to reverse climate change. Thanks. So, how much time have we got?
10, 15 minutes.
Great, okay, so let's start with some questions, comments.
Now, that was wonderful, Robert. So coherent, such a vision. But at many points during your talk, I just thought, and pardon me being specific, Scott Morrison, as a representative of those who you and we need to convince, have we got any hope? And he stands there not only as our political representative, but as our representative of Christianity. And why don't you make an appointment with him and go and present him your vision?
Sure. Look, I'd love to open up the political conversations around these topics, but I feel that I'm exploring some sort of deep philosophical foundations for new thinking. And I think that my ideas are challenging to people on all sides of politics, in fact. And so I think that it's possible to hope for engagement from a range of different sides of politics. Yeah. Oh, Sandy?
Thank you for the presentation. I think you've rightly said that the situation is worse than we are led to believe in most parts of the media. The alarmists, okay, you're right. Secondly, I would have liked to have heard a bit more about the actual alternative to emission reduction, that is the real possibility of withdrawing carbon from the atmosphere. I think that's something that is not well understood, and I would really emphasise that as a big part of what comes to me out of what you've said. But I just think the public needs to be better informed about what might be possible, because it is a genuine alternative approach to resolving the problem of carbon pollution. That's not a question, that's affirming what you said.
Yeah.
And the question is really somewhere else. What I'm wanting to say is that I think I agree with you 100% about the relevance of the biblical apocalyptic thinking. I think that's entirely relevant. And I do think that it should challenge us in the way that you say. That is, it should challenge us to look after the earth, not to think that we should just get away from it. That's the big change that some Christians need. I think most of us are not on that side, but you're right about that. I'm less persuaded by seeing astronomy as the critical turning point. I think it's true that there is a significant astronomical background to many of the biblical ideas. I think that's certainly true. Greco-Roman gods were thought to inhabit actual heavenly bodies, for example. So there's a spiritual reading of the cosmos from the past. And that's not one that we can easily pick up. But I just think that the apocalyptic ideas, as expressed in the Bible, have their own power. And they do persuade people directly when you can just listen well enough to them without necessarily having to explain them with another whole set of things. So my question is really how, I'm not persuaded, I suppose, about the astronomical analogy or scientific basis for that as being essential to the use of the apocalyptic methods. I think they have their own power and their own framework for expression. So that's my reaction to your whole presentation.
Those are really good points, Sandy, and I think that what they require is a much more measured sort of engagement, because I think the way I'm bringing in astronomy with the idea of zodiac ages is just completely heretical as far as Christian traditions are concerned, and it's something that's been really heavily suppressed. I would say it actually was a core of some original Gnostic thinking that gave rise to the writing of the story of Jesus, but then was completely eliminated under the orthodoxy of Christendom. And digging beneath that rubble of the archaeology of Christendom is what I've been really engaged with in a way that I think most Christians, most non-Christians just find is outside of their thinking today. But I'll go to Rebecca.
Well, my comment is on the same exact thing that Sandy's just said, but when I heard what you said about those zodiac ages and the graphs and the time, to me that is reconciling where the climate deniers are coming from, because they're saying we have these long cycles and that's why I don't believe that it's human. So,
but that's complete rubbish. See, the
well,
trouble is...
No, I'm not saying it's rubbish.
Yeah.
I agree that what we are adding is very serious, but I'm saying that in that thought is reconciling why are the climate deniers saying what they are saying, what they think, because of these long cycles. So if we add what you're saying to it, that's a way of reaching them. That's my point.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Rebecca. Thank you.
A couple of things. First of all, I'm sort of concerned. I don't think that there's a conflict between emissions reduction and geoengineering. I think we need to actually do both very urgently. There's not much point saying that one is very difficult and the other is very difficult, so we're going to do one but not the other.
Sadly, there is a really big conflict, and we see it in the UN, where we've got this statement that geoengineering is